So later, so we need to catch up a little bit, talk a little bit about poems 2.18 and 2.20. This isn't the best way to do it, but you know what? It's a little bit of something. So go ahead and be looking at poem 2.18, the one that started off with non ebur neque aureum mea renidet in domo lacunar. And we'd started that, discussing that back on Thursday. The whole business about, you're not going to find golden ceilings in my house, no ivory, wooden beams cut from Africa, all that kind of stuff, right? And he's suggesting that kind of humility, right? We talked about that. And you've got all these examples of elegance, the golden ceiling, the marble, the Himetian marble, the wooden beams from Africa, reference to Spartan purple there, the Laconicos purpuras. So lots of good references there. And again, he's also trotting out some of his knowledge. We talked about that before, a little bit of that Alexandrian sort of thing. He says, you know what, I've got fides, he said, at ingeni benigno vena, and a kind vein of wit. He said, that's what I've got going for me, not all that other stuff. And then he says, I really don't ask for anything more, right? He said, of the gods, nihil super deus lacesso. And he says, or even of my patron, my potentem amicum. Of course, he's referring to Maecenas there. And again, we talked about all that. Then he picks it up here in, starting in verse 15. He says, truditur dies die novaeque peregunt in terrira lunae. Right, so he says, day follows day, new moons continue one passing the other. And he says, and still you, and the two here, the pronoun two, and then the subject of logos in the next line, that's just a generic two. That's as if we would say, what you want to do when applying for college, it's the generic sort of you, right? And so he says, day passes day, moons come and go. And he says, still, he says, you have people, or you are looking to cut marble, secunda marmora. You've got the gerundive there, literally marble to be cut, sub ipsum funas, from the grave itself. And you got to understand, one of the things that Romans often did was they took building materials from one thing and used it for something else. So, for example, part of the reason the Colosseum is in the degraded state that it is, they pillaged it for its marble and used it, and even some of the concrete, just to build other things. We don't do that today. Typically, you're not going to find somebody pillaging parts of St. Peter's Basilica to go build another church in Rome. But the ancients did that. They had no problem with that. And he says, so here you are. He says, you're looking to cut marble from the tomb, but nevertheless, sepulchre immemor. Nevertheless, you're not mindful of the tomb. You're not thinking about the fact that you're going to die, even though that's where you're quarrying your marble. And you struis domos. You're building these big houses from this stuff. And then he goes on. He talks about Baiae. We may have mentioned that the other day. The city of Baiae was a renowned party city, not too far from Rome. And he says you're pushing hard. He says to urges, you're pushing hard to assumovera litera, to push out the shores of Baiae. You actually want to extend the coastline out into the water. You want to make it bigger. And he goes on. He says, he says it's not enough for you. Basically the shoreline as it is. So you've literally got to change the geography of the land there. And then he says, quod usque proximos revelis agri terminos et ultra limites clientium salis awatos. He says, what's the point of all this? All right. That's really what the quid means. He says, what are you doing here? What is the point of tearing down the terminus? Is where we get the word terminal, and a terminus was literally the boundary stone. It was a physical stone used to mark the boundary between one property and another. And he says, so here you are. He says, what's the point? You are tearing down the proximos terminus, the neighboring boundary stones of the field. And he says, in being greedy, avaris, that's where we get the word avarice in English. He says, you're jumping over, salis, the boundaries of your clients, or the people who rent land from you. So even people who rent land from you, you're taking their land and just adding it to your own. Quick note there, that whole salus limites there, lines 25, 26, that may ring a bell to you from the founding story of Rome. Remember, as Romulus and Remus were both building a city, Remus got a little bit upset at Romulus, and so he saw Romulus was building his defensive wall, and Remus literally jumped over it. Salidra is the word to jump there, and Romulus killed him for it. So I think that's a verb that would resonate in the Roman mind as well, hearkening back to that. And just as that ended badly, Horace is saying, hey, you probably shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be jumping over boundaries, being greedy, trying to take in more land. And then when you do that, what happens? He says, well, Pelator paternos and sino, ferens deos et uxor et vir sortidosque natos. He says, here's this poor uxor et vir, this poor husband and wife, clutching ferens, their gods, holding their household gods, being driven out, their little children as well. So here's a family that may has rented land from you, been a tenant, been a client on the land, and here you're taking over their land. Even though they're renting it from you, you're really taking it over just to expand your estate. And here's a family who's been kicked out. And he says, really, how bad is that? And then he goes on to say, he says, nulla certior tamen rapacis orci fine destinata aula divitem manet erum. And this is a really kind of a commonplace, again, it's a trope, a motif, I think we were talking about the other day, the idea that death comes for us all right? He says, there is nulla aula, there is no courtyard that is certior, more certain than the destinata fine, than the destined end of Orcus. Orcus is another word for the underworld. And notice how Orcus is described here, rapacis orci. There's no more certain palace than, or courtyard, than the destined end of rapacious Orcus. Rapacious, from rapio, rapera, rapui, raptus, meaning to seize or to take. The underworld seizes and takes everything. Death claims all. And here you are building a big palace on earth, but really there is no more certain palace, no more certain aula than the great house of darkness, the house of death. And Hades in Greek literally means the house of darkness. He says that's coming for all of us. Quid ultra tendus. He says, again, what's the point? Why are you stretching further? Aequatellus pauperi recluditer regumque pueris, blah, blah, blah. He says, look, the earth is equally open, right? So the earth is going to swallow up equally for the pauper, the pauper, the poor person, and for the pueris regum, for the children of kings. It doesn't matter if you're high or low born, rich or poor, death is going to take us all. He says the satiles orci, the ferryman of Orcus, so again referencing Charon, the boatman who ferries you across the river Styx. He says, he calidum Promethea revexit aura captus. He said he was not captivated by gold. You can't bribe the ferryman to bring you back to the side or to the shore of life. And he says, he couldn't be bribed to carry back Prometheus, one of the great mythological stories of the underworld. And he mentions several others here. He mentions Tantalus and Pelops. You could look those up if you really wanted to, but the point is, here's a couple of famous characters that any Roman reader would know from the underworld. They're there. They're in the underworld. They couldn't buy their way out. And so he says, and it's interesting here, he says, hic levare functum pauperum laboribus vocatus atque non vocatus audit. And whether called or not called, okay, whether you summon death or you don't summon death, guess what? Death's a-coming. And he says, death hears the poor person. He focuses on the pauperum, and really sets him free. He hears him to levare him from his labors when they're done. So what's the point in amassing all the treasure? Again, you think about Scripture: store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not corrupt, and where thieves do not break in and steal. That's Jesus, his words. And again, it's a very common sort of trope. Taking a quick look then at poem 20. So he says, he's talking about his own death here. He's older at this point, and he says, "Non usitata nec tenui ferrar penna beformis." He says, I am not carried along. He says, I am not a ferrar. Usitata tenui penna beformis. He says, I'm not carried along on a weak or just average sort of wings. He says, I, a biformis vates, a biform, or a poet of two forms. You know, well, what does that mean? Well, he's going to allude to some sort of transformation or metamorphosis of himself. He is a poet in that he is a human being, and a poet in that regard, but he's got a second form that he's going to reveal here in a moment. He says, I'm not going to be carried along on some unknown weak wings. And interesting that he uses that phrase about being carried along by wings. That's going to be explained here in a moment as he goes on. He says, nor will I in terris morabor. I'm not going to delay or linger any longer on earth for any particular length of time. And then he says, I will urbes relinquam. I will leave the cities behind. Non ego pauperum sanguis parentum. Non ego quem vocas delecte macenas obibo nextigia cohibebor unda. He says, now I'm not of the blood of poor parents. So in other words, I didn't come from poor stock. But he says, it is not I whom you are calling now, beloved Maecenas. It is not I who will die. Not I who will be cohibebor, circled around by the Stygian wave or the waves of the river Styx. What does that mean? What do you mean I'm not going to die? Well, and you kind of want to bear that poem 18 in mind where he said everybody dies, right? So what does he mean? He says, I'm not really going to be dying here. Well, he says, Yam residunt curribus asperae apelles et alba mutor in alitem superne nascunturque leves perdigitos umerosque plumae. So he says, even now, he says, asperae pelles, rough skin, is residuant. It's kind of sagging down around my ankles. If you've ever been around an older person, you know, skin gets a little bit saggy there. And he says, I am mutor. I am being changed. That's where we get mutate into an album alitem, into a snow white swan. And he says, leves plumae, light feathers are being born or are growing throughout my literally he says fingers and shoulders. Well, that's his white hair, right? So his white hair, his hair's turning white. Again, typical, most cultures have that, the notion of gray hair, white hair as a symbol of old age. And he's transforming that into the notion, oh, no. It's not just white hair. It's actually my white plumage. I'm turning into a swan in my old age. Then he says, Yam daedaleo okior icaro visam gementis lictora Bospori certisque blah, 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 blah. And then he says, soon a canorus ales, soon as a songbird, a sonorous bird, he says, okior icaro daedaleo. He says, even more famous than, swifter even than Icarus, the son of Daedalus, I will see, or I will visit, and he lists all these different places. The Gementis litera Bosphori, the shores of the roaring Bosphorus, the Syrtes, which are sandbars off the coast of North Africa, the land of the Gaetulian Syrtes, I should say, and the land of the Hyperboreans. Again, all these are just places around. If you look at the map of the Mediterranean world, he's just mentioning places all around the Mediterranean world and showing off a little bit of his geographical knowledge, again, a little bit of this Alexandrian thing. But how is it he's really turning into a bird? How is it he's able to visit all these places? We'll talk about that here in just a moment. He even continues that then in the next stanza. Me colcus et qui dissimula metum Marsae cohortus dacus et ultimi noscent Geloni. He says far off Colchis will know me. And Colchis, you may recall, is the land where Jason found the golden fleece. So this is over on the shore of the Black Sea. So he's talking about far off places in the Roman world. And he says, this place will know me. And the Marsi, which is another group of people, and the Dacians and the Geloni. He says, all these different people, all these will know me. And he says, Amsint inani funera naniae luctusque turpes et querimoniae. He says, don't want any dirges or funeral songs. There will be none of that stuff that will be absent at my funeral. And no shameful sort of grieving. He says, Compesque clamorem et sepulchri mite super vacuos honores. He says, put away or shut down all of the shouting, the clamor, and he says, send away the empty honors of the tomb. So what is he talking about here? Well, elsewhere Horace had said that he would live forever through his poetry. And so in a very real sense, he is going to live in all of those places as his poetry gets published and sent around. And we've talked before, I think, about the word fama, F-A-M-A, coming from the word for, fari fatus, meaning to speak. Your fama is that which is said about you. And in a very real sense, for many of the Romans, that was eternal life. What do people say about you after your death? So putting that together with poem 18, there's the traditional sense of, don't have all the monuments gold and marble and all that kind of stuff, because death is coming for us all. We're all going to die, and blah, 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 blah. But then Horace can't get rid of that, because then in poem 20, he says, yeah, I'm not really going to die. Now, my legacy is not going to be in gold and marble. In fact, it's going to be better than that. My legacy is going to be in my poetry that goes to the very ends of the earth. So hope that helps out just a little bit. Kind of looking maybe back at a couple of other things. Grammatically, if you've got any particular questions about the grammar, I think the grammar is pretty straightforward. A few words you probably had to look up. But hey, if you've got any particular questions, just send me an email and I'll try to get those answered for you.